This is Scott Davis from the Morning Breach with a special news bulletin. Coming off the heels of major breaches happening within the industry, from SolarWinds to FireEye, Microsoft, more recently Malwarebytes, Sonicwall has come out with an urgent security notice for all of the NetExtender VPN clients and the SMA 100s. To discuss Sonicwall's breach, I brought in Matt Lee from IconicIT. Sorry about that, Matt. Just to kind of chat about it. But Matt, do you mind just talking about what have you heard? What do you know?
Yeah, so about 10:15 last night Central Time, Sonicwall came out and made a very interesting announcement in a very strange way. They said, hey, we've been breached by sophisticated threat actors, was their term, and that you should be aware that if you're using an SMA 100 series and a few other SMA appliances, or if you're using the NetExtender version 10 and up client, that you should be aware and you should take the following actions. It looks like they're saying that there's two parts to this attack. And TLDR, really quick, I think what we should distill from this is earlier advice that normal firewall level VPN connectivity with NetExtender 10.0 and later is probably actually not necessary to have the whitelisting and have the MFA. Now, should you do the MFA? Yes, you should do the MFA. You should always do the MFA, to Scott's point, as well as mine. But that being said, the immediate knee-jerk need to whitelist and restrict down to an IP address for traditional firewall level connectivity to the office that was forced upon us through a lot of what we talked about from COVID is maybe less poignant, and more of that on the WAN level attack is actually guided towards the SMA appliances, the SMA 100s, and the ones that were identified in that bulletin that was attached. So that being said, essentially what it boils down to is you probably more have a LAN level attack. And I'll read their exact words from that. But they said, NX10 itself has issues. NetExtender 10 has issues. And we took it down until we can remediate. Therefore, an attacker would have to target someone's machine. And they said target, right? So it does sound like HTTP level attack to that. Have to target someone's machine that's running a vulnerable NX. And then that user has to have a legit connection, right? So it's not going to be, spoofing. It's not going to be attack level at the firewall WAN. It has to have a legit connection to a firewall. In that instance, the attacker, and they put may in italics, saying they may get access to the network, but that's a long chain of events. SMA 100 is the biggest focus right now. And so I think what you have is SMA 100 itself has a WAN level attack. And if you are using SMA appliances, you probably should deal with exactly what they said, whitelisting and 2FA and multi-factor capability where possible. But if you're using traditional Sonicwalls and you're connecting your clients to their offices through that extensibility, then the likelihood is it's still the danger of the attacks against the local LAN. So should you deal with it? Yes. But the surface of that gets restricted down to public Wi-Fi, hotels, their own house having, Mirai botnet or something running in it. And so just have an understanding that I do believe that it's a different risk.
Yeah, I think the big takeaway, when you look at it from, an enterprise is easy, you have one environment, but for an MSP that's utilizing Sonicwall as their primary firewall, to have to go through and try to figure out the whitelist scope. And this modern workforce that we live in today has everybody using VPN because it's the secure way to connect. So kind of in your mind, what is involved for an MSP to really get their clients up to date?
Depending on what happens and if they release a CVE, as you and I've done the research, right? But, if they release a CVE and a patch, then maybe path is really just patching. But if it's not, you almost have to make a choice of, do I apply protection first by locking down only to whitelist? And if no one can get in, they can't get in, and they'll start tickets, and I'll deal with those tickets as they come in. Or do you try to make it from an operational perspective where you start applying whitelists by gathering and apply them when you've reached the bell curve and you've reached most people? I think the challenge really is just operationally saying every coffee shop, every hotel, every time my modem gets restarted and I get a new dynamic address at home, I'm now going to have to put a whitelist, and that might be a ticket, and that might be a down user, and that might be an impact to production. And, it's just a real challenge. It's a real scale problem. Interesting one to see how this develops between now and your next show. But yeah.
Yeah, and I think in a broader picture, it brings up a couple points that I like to emphasize. One, documentation. I can't think of any MSP out there that's trying to document what everybody's home IP addresses are, or the IP addresses that they're working from. I know people.
right? In other
Or
ways.
yeah. So kind of, that adds a scope of, challenge to this. And that was really brought on by the whole modern workforce, which really pushed and forced everyone to utilize these VPN connectivity. But to point out on the bulletin itself, the line MFA must be enabled on all
Must.
Sonicwall SMA firewall and my Sonicwall accounts.
Yeah.
Is it kind of, now I'm asking some speculation here. Do you think it's more of them just trying to push MFA, or do you think maybe there's something underlying with that?
My first thought goes to that, right, Scott, that there'd be a discussion about pushing MFA and ensuring that MFA is enabled. But it also leads back to, potentially things they're seeing. I don't know. My hat is kind of in the court of probably just added abundance of caution from MFA. But I think speculatively, you could argue that if there is a session that's tied to an MFA token that they're using in some form, and the way they use that in the VPN connection, is that part of this, leverage that makes it impossible if there's an MFA token as opposed to the way they do it with normal connection. But, it's just IPsec at the end of the day. My gut says there's probably a vulnerability in the way they've implemented it in the newer versions. And MFA is probably just an additional best practice for that. But I could be wrong, right? So.
I agree. I think if you listen to any of the Morning Breach episodes, I talk about, I think in every one, the importance of turning MFA on. At this point, if you're not utilizing it, you're behind the curve.
Borderline negligence,
yeah.
Right? Like it's borderline negligence at this point.
The one other thing, obviously, you are an MSP, so you're going in, you're seeing a lot of different customers. You're going into even customers that don't have MSPs, and I think if I put on my MSP hat from when I worked in the MSPs, I understand. I'd go into a site and I'd see a Sonicwall that's 2 years out of date. Are we still seeing that? If how can somebody really check to see if their firewalls are being updated? Is there anything that someone can do?
Yeah, that's actually a great question. And the industry's solving some of those things. For us, we replace with our own firewalls, and that actually is not Sonicwall at this time. And so our breadth of exposure is a little bit reduced in that regard. But that being said, there aren't great tool sets that are out there for true, pure, Qualys-like, Nessus-like vulnerability management scanning and data gathering of that, right? I mean, you've got your AUVIX and you've got your different providers, and I don't want to name names, but there's a lot of different people that do some of that tool set, but nobody that really focuses on that. And there's some really interesting products coming to market that I happen to be working with their teams and some things that help you see it much easier. Here's the firewall, here's the version, here's the 22 CVEs that are tied to it. At that point, when this security bulletin ultimately becomes a CVE, which it likely will be, that would be something that would hit you, then help you solve that more systemically. The other thing I would say is that if you do lineate and use the same firewalls across the board, even if they do create this one universal risk, as we have here, you have a universal solve to that universal risk. And as the cloud type connections and automation capabilities would get better, then those auto remediations get easier as well. But yeah, how would you tell? I mean, you would have to manually verify that, document it, and hopefully you have some automation. Another great way would be this awesome company I know. I don't want to name names, but they roar. Yep. And they do have that kind of capability. And one of the first thoughts when I saw this is, that's a really great gathering tool. Like that would be the first place that I would suggest you go look at the breadth of your exposure, not necessarily at the client side, but certainly at the firewall level, at the firewall versions, at the things that you would gather about that firewall, change control. Did this get implemented? Did we put those things in? What are the delineations? Having some type of automated systems really goes a long way to, to take a conversation maybe without naming a vendor name.
Yeah, and I appreciate you not naming vendors. Some of them absolutely. I know I could sit here and I could name vendors all day long in every episode. Some of them I'm employed in. But, I do try to remain agnostic across the board with these.
My Scott Davis friend from that Scott Davis. Yeah.
No, I appreciate that. The last question I have for you, obviously, we've gone through FireEye. FireEye identified SolarWinds. From SolarWinds, we found Microsoft. We found Malwarebytes. What's next? Like, what can 2021 bring next at this point?
Yeah. There is no chance that you should ever live believing you're not compromised anymore. Mm-hmm. I think the conversation that 2021 should bring is an understanding of conversation on risk. I think it's an understanding of conversation that we have to just assume compromise. And if we assume compromise, we start building operational structures that help protect us. We start separating data out and thinking about data. What data do I gather? What data do I hold? Who has access to it? Should they have access to it? Where should I store it? What's the data life cycle? How should I just... All of those things are things that are just part of what it takes to survive in general, but we push those off to the side because we go, I've got great tools. I'm fine. 2020 and the beginning of 2021 proves tools don't matter. It proves that it doesn't matter. You're going to be compromised. I could do it by going into your office. I could do it by getting an employee in your office. I have to start assuming that even though you're a small to mid-sized business, you can't live in this world where you think you're in a bubble. And more importantly, you have to realize you're probably in some degree of compromise at all times. And that's not a scary thing. That's not a FUD. That is the reality of situation. That's the reality of intelligence since the beginning of time, right? Intelligence and counterintelligence exist for a reason. So I would say that 2021 is the year of I'm already compromised. But it destigmatizes it and it changes it and makes us drive towards it and be willing to report it. Do you think that Sonicwall would have reported this as briefly and quickly as they did if they didn't have 5 other giant pillars in front of them that just admitted the same thing? Not happening. No. It's Home Depot, stalling 10 years. It's. I think we're looking at a positive thing out of this. And I know, not to be the anti-story, but I think there's some good evidence.
And I think I completely agree with you. I think it all starts with your policies and procedures. And I don't know if you've been following the Morning Breach here in the month of January. We focused on policies and procedures, not only in our episodes on Tuesdays and Thursdays, but we broke them out into separate series. And we also just did the incident response plan this last week. And you can find templates of all of these and what's important and what should be included in those going through the Morning Breach videos. So I think it all starts with policies and procedures. It's going in it that with the assumption that chances are in 2021, you're likely going to be facing some sort of a situation that could indicate a breach. And as government laws, as compliant regulations catch up with everything that happened in 2020, the term what signifies a breach is going to expand greatly. And
Definitely.
It's going to expand not just in the compliance regulations, but also with your cyber insurance policies. As cyber insurances are coming around for your annual renewal, that price is probably going to jump. So it's making sure you have that proper policies, the procedures in place, you have the plan, so if something happens, you know what to do next. But Matt, thank you for grabbing some time, joining me today. I think this is a hot topic. I think we're going to cover a lot more of it come Tuesday this week after a couple days, and likely the CVE coming out here probably tomorrow or the next day. I can't imagine them waiting too long on this. But I appreciate your time today, Matt.